continue our look at Mark, where we are now in chapter 3 is Jesus has done a number of healings. He's had some rabbinic dispute with his co-religionists, and he's appointed 12 disciples. And we read, "Then he went home, and the crowd came together again, so that they could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, 'He is out of his mind.' And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, 'He has Beelzebul, and by the ruler of the demons he casts out demons.' And he called them to him and spoke to them in parables. 'How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand. But his end has come. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered. Truly I tell you, people will be forgiven for their sins and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never have forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. For they had said, he has an unclean spirit.' Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him. They said to him, 'Your mother and your brothers and your sisters are outside asking for you.' He replied, 'Who are my mother and my brothers?' And looking at those who sat around him, he said, 'Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother.'" The reading ends here. This is an extraordinarily diverse set of readings, again, as summer readings tend to be. But as I was thinking about it, one of the things that holds them together is this. We walk around with assumptions and expectations in our mind, and those often deceive us. But the trouble occurs in that we hold on to the assumptions and expectations even when the facts say otherwise. We want those assumptions and expectations to be borne out. And that helps us to hold together these readings. It wasn't in part of the reading, but Samuel has already moved against the old idea of charismatic judges being lifted up for the people of Israel in a seemingly arbitrary way of having at least some centralized leadership. He was staying up north in Ramah, but he appointed his sons to be judges down south. Judgeship wasn't hereditary. Kingship's hereditary. Worse, just like his, if you will, stepfather, Eli the priest, his sons were dissolute and corrupt. So he had changed the ideas of what it was to be a judge in Israel. His corrupt sons were violating the understandable expectations they had of being a judge in Israel. And so the people want a king. They imagine King Arthur. They imagine Queen Victoria. They imagine all the good things they're going to get from having a central authority, a king. They're going to have stability and power, and most importantly, they're going to be like all the other nations. God sees it as a rejection of God and God's plans for them. And God has Samuel say, here's what you should expect from a king. You're not going to get much. What you're going to get is someone who's going to take and take and take and take. 6 times the same verb is applied to the king. You're not going to get much, but lots are going to be taken from you. Even the traditional tithe to the temple is going to go instead to the king. They've been warned. This people who lived under a thumb of a pharaoh have been warned what will happen when they get a king. That their expectations win, even over the words of prophecy. Paul approaches the same issue, but from a radically different point. Sometimes I've heard people say they do not understand how people can face death without faith. Today and then, Paul has us consider the value of facing suffering in this life. The thought was when Messiah would come, life would be good and the followers would be blessed. Instead, Paul gives you a catalog of all the horrible things that have befallen him. The underlying assumption then is you must be wrong and God must be punishing you. 2,000 years later, we've advanced not one step. Over and over, our co-religionists will not ever quote Paul here because it doesn't fit on a bumper sticker. They hold that bad things are deserved punishments from God. And without blinking an eye, they say they deserve only blessings as Christians. It's utter heresy, but it's the American Orthodox view of religion. Paul knows better. Paul really just extends his argument from last week that we hold treasures in earthen vessels. That in our earthen vessels of our lives, we receive both blessings and troubles. But even sufferings, he says, can unite us with Christ. He knows full well the frailty of human existence, whether you're a Christian or not. But he's an apocalyptic thinker. He says that Jesus Christ unveils a different way of God in the world. After all, Jesus dies a hideous death around 30 years old. It's not right, but it could be transformed into a new and better purpose. So he talks about, if you will, 2 ways of looking at life. What he calls the outer nature, we could call physical situations. It's subject to all the sufferings any human being goes through, Christian or not. It's an earthen vessel, but Paul knows it can hold junk or treasure. It can hold suffering. It can hold blessing. It's part of the human experience. How do we respond to it? He says that Jesus already takes care of that by transforming what he calls the inner nature. And he's very clear what that is. The inner nature, if you will, you could call the soul. What does God do to make the life of Jesus visible in our lives? Paul even says, visible in our bodies, like a scar. God enacts transformation. God brings life. God shines light in our heart. God is always at work in spite of, in the midst of this life. God renews us day in and day out. even when it is not apparent that life is going well. Or put differently, God is at work giving us the power and virtue to accept, face, and change life as it comes. Not because we are somehow lifted up out of this world, but instead we are agents of God in this world for what this life brings us. In other words, Paul sees hope as the great virtue. The God who is at work in our mortal bodies is the same God who brought Jesus back to life. Now, hope is not optimism. It is not a conviction that things just keep getting better on their own. It's a conviction that things will improve despite evidence of the contrary. That in God's hand, life can improve. That we can perceive blessings even amidst hardship. In this world and the world to come. In Bible study this morning, we talked about our reading from Mark as an apocalyptic reading too. That Jesus is unveiling a war of the worlds. A war of how to look at life, how to live life. And Jesus is stark. You can live it God's way or you can live it another way. And you can see it in the procession of oppositions here. The neighbors turn against him. They're all pressing in to get a healing, but they've told the family, we think Jesus has lost it. His family themselves, in my view, are trying to protect him from himself. They might even fear he has a demon. And the religious authorities have created yet another conflict with him. In other words, the people who should be in the best position to know Jesus fail to see it. And the religious people, and maybe even the family and neighbors, attribute it to evil. They see good and attribute it to evil. Apparently, no one was prepared in this shift in Jesus' life's work that has occurred after his baptism by John. At the end, if I were in Jesus' family, my heart would have been broken when he asks, who is my brother and who is my sister, who is my mother? It's saved, if you will, because Jesus has recast family. He's recast our boundary into his new movement. Everybody who can follow God's way, Jesus says, is part of his family. There's no longer any outsiders, but we who are called are holders of the secrets of the kingdom. We who have been bound by the powers that be are released to live our life according to what God wants. And the powers that be are the ones that are bound by that self-same power. Family is no longer at the center of Jesus' life. God's way is at the center of his life. All those who follow are drawn into the inner circle of Jesus Christ, just like the 12 he's just appointed. Let me close with an example of this conflict of perspectives. I wrote my column for the local paper on a documentary that's coming out on Fred Rogers. Let me tell you a quick story, and some of you may have even seen this, but just in case, let me give you some background. You all remember Fred Rogers. I grew up with him because he was on local Pittsburgh TV the year I was born. And you remember him as being an extraordinarily gentle person. Some saw him indeed as effeminate. Right when there was national public television, the Nixon administration, to pay for the war in Vietnam, get these numbers, wanted to reduce public television and public radio from $20 million to $10 million. You know, with a pittance in current finance. Mr. Rogers was just being released nationally. He was asked to testify before Congress. And in those days, Congress actually passed appropriation bills on time. And that's how you got your money. He had to go testify before the head of the committee, John Pastore. If you don't remember him, well, for Illinois people, this would be like a Mayor Daley type of person. He was a lifelong politician. He was elected to Congress in the 30s, was defeated somewhere around 1940, became Attorney General or on the staff in Rhode Island, became governor, came back and had been senator for over 20 years. This was a tough, old politician. So just whatever you need to get that picture in your head. You got Fred Rogers and a tough old politician. To everyone, he spoke for like 6 minutes. To everyone's astonishment, he went into the strong man's house and plundered it. He utterly charmed John Pastore, because Pastore probably hadn't met a gentleman in 40 years in Washington. Fred Rogers quoted one of his children's songs to John Pastore. What do you do with the hurt you feel? A hurt so deep, a mad so much that it makes you want to bite. I would have thought Pastore would have laughed him out of the joint. Pastore's utterly charmed and goes, is there a way for me to see recordings of your program? I really would. And at the end, Pastore says, sir, you've earned your $20 million. And he appropriated $22 million to public television. Fred Rogers' utter sincerity and utter clarity about how he wanted the world to look charmed maybe the toughest politician in Washington in those days. One way of living the world came in conflict with another, and all our expectations were broken. And Fred Rogers was honored in Washington, D.C. almost 50 years ago, next year. Each one of us continues to live between the times, but between different ways of looking at our lives and living our lives.